And we have a very special occasion this week to welcome friends from countries that are often producing for our markets, and where we need to take very good care about the labor rights and other rights. But in this seminar, we focus on labor rights. So I would like to give you a very brief update of what's actually happening around the EU Commission's proposal on corporate sustainability due diligence. Latest this morning, we had the responsible EU Commissioner Didier Reynders in our Legal Affairs Committee, which is responsible to formulate the Parliament's position to be voted in the plenary. We actually hope to vote in the committee in March already. It will be tough, but we'll manage, I think. Then in May, we're supposed to vote in the plenary. So it's an absolutely right timing for this event to give the latest feedback and advice to legislators. And I will later be joined with another colleague, Barry Andrews, from another political group. I'm representing the Greens European Free Alliance, and Barry is from Renew Group. So we need to hear from our friends representing the labor unions and people from the global South countries. So I would think that the three items that have been selected to this meeting are really, they represent the core of this legislation that we want to see in place. First, what does it mean that there is a due diligence duty? And second, what does it mean that we discuss the scope of the value chain? And thirdly, access to justice for victims. And I very much believe that none of these elements should go wrong in the EU legislation. They're all very important. We do not make companies accountable if we don't define the duty of due diligence well. And we certainly will not have the full picture of things that can go wrong in a value chain if we don't have the whole scope of the value chain covered, and that will be discussed in the next part of this meeting. And finally, access to justice. There is no accountability without justice. So I'm not going to speak longer. I'm just saying that there are still quite many disagreements and disputes among the legislators. We do have the EU member states position since December, and even for some quite progressive and front-running member states, it was not a good compromise. And there are hopes that the European Parliament could improve it in many ways. I'll just give you one example, which is really very awkward, that the member states have decided that the finance sector is only going to be in the scope of this directive if the member state would choose so. And even many financial companies are saying that, what is this? We cannot operate in such a market. So just to give you an example, that we still have a lot to do. And now, if I would like to turn to our speakers, on my left, we have Joseph Wilde from OECD-Watch and SOMO. And I have a question to Joseph. Now, the Commission's proposal gives priority status to so-called third-party verification, meaning audits and sector initiatives, as a means of due diligence. So now you have obviously experience of monitoring how such measures function. And what are we to make of all this? So how can the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive best promote effective due diligence by companies? So I would invite you to speak for about 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Heidi. And thanks to the organizers, ECCJ, and all of you for being here. And thanks especially to you, Heidi, for your continued leadership in the Parliament on this issue, and to my colleagues and friends from far away for being here to share with us your perspectives. Thank you for the question, Heidi. And it is something that SOMO and OECD-Watch, we've been monitoring for a while. And in fact, we just have done some research looking particularly at the issue of auditing and certification and sectoral initiatives, sectoral schemes in due diligence. It's something that we, as SOMO and as OECD-Watch, have been really sort of monitoring in terms of effectiveness of due diligence and looking at how these different schemes and can play a role or not in due diligence. And when we think about the legislation, what we see is a situation coming up where schemes around auditing and multi-stakeholder initiatives can play a role in helping companies do their due diligence, but it is absolutely not something that should be taken to be a proxy for due diligence. And that's why our report is titled A Piece, Not a Proxy. We reviewed quite a few stakeholder initiatives and auditing schemes, and we sort of analyzed what role they've been able to play, where they've been effective, where they've not been effective, and what would be the most effective way for legislation at the European level or at the national level to deal with those. And so what you see is that even particularly some of the stakeholder initiatives that might have some quality criteria, might perform well on some certain degree of feasibility and quality standards, still have a very difficult time in actually delivering impacts for people on the ground and results and improvements for people on the ground. And so the analysis that we've been able to make and to come up with is that the just like the OECD guidelines do, in fact, is say that these types of initiatives, auditing can play a role in companies' due diligence, but absolutely should not be taken to be a proxy or even an indicator of due diligence in the end. And especially this is talking about part of the duty in terms of what companies should do in terms of due diligence, but particularly also when we get to the enforcement part, that any sort of participation by a company or its suppliers or its business partners in these industry schemes should not serve as any kind of a safe harbor or any kind of even a lighter enforcement regime, just because of the issues with actual impact on the ground. And if we do so, if the legislation does so, as is currently proposed by the Commission, what we really end up doing is creating sort of a paper reality that breaks the logic of due diligence, which is supposed to be risk-based and focused on risks and impacts on the ground, and create some sort of an in-between paper step where you would be asking a regulator to not spend its time looking at what is the actual impact on the ground, but to look at sort of a paper reality in terms of due diligence. So I think that, again, if we look at companies will use multi-stakeholder initiatives and auditing and certification if they help them be effective in their due diligence. And if the duty specifies that companies remain responsible for their own individual due diligence, and they can't outsource this, they can't use any other initiative as a proxy, and the enforcement focuses on looking at the actual impact on the ground, that is how we're going to have the most effective legislation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joe. And indeed, we can only refer to the report that you published, A Piece, Not a Proxy, which says a lot. So then I will turn to Sar Mora, who represents the Cambodian Alliance of Trade Unions, and a very important country for us in the Trade Committee in the European Parliament, because we suspended partially, the EU suspended partially the everything but arms benefits because of political and labor rights violations in the country. And I don't think much has changed for the better. So anyway, I would like to ask Sar about what we can call effective and meaningful stakeholder consultation. Could you describe a little bit from your experience as a trade unionist in Cambodia, what are the challenges of meaningful stakeholder consultation, and how could the EU due diligence legislation best overcome these? Because indeed, a meaningful stakeholder consultation is also a disputed element of the legislation. Companies sometimes do not understand that they really should talk and listen to even to their fiercest critics, because that's the way to understand how their operating environment actually is feeling the impacts. So, Sar, I'd like to give you the floor for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Hello everyone. Before I answer to the question, I just give some picture of like situation in Cambodia, especially for government workers. And then you know, it's still the situation of workers is still facing difficult, low wages. Condition is still not good. Still in high risk, for example, when they transportation to the workplace, they're still using a truck and then put 50 or 70 people in a truck to go to work. And then the big responsibility for worker to their family, you know, because in Cambodia, there's no like better social protection, or, you know, it's still a lot of responsibility for worker, for their children, for their parents. So even though after 2014 struggle, you know, the wage increased, but it's still, you know, a lot of issue for worker. And if look into their rights, also lately, that is not good for workers in Cambodia also, because after 2018, that the ruling party dissolved opposition party, Cambodia become like one party state, you know, just one party in the parliament, and then they just change the law, or they just pass the law that more repression, that more benefit, or in the way of kind of for a ruling party to control, to keep themselves in power. So that the situation, you know, and one of the law, it's new trade union law, which is more difficult for workers to organize, more difficult for workers to set up a union. You know, it is, and when we look into like what's called stakeholders, you know, I think this is like in situation like in Cambodia, we have to, you know, very careful with that, because in ruling party, they try to influence into like even civil society, even in trade unions. So it's really difficult for independent union to, you know, to survive, or to, you know, to running in the way to support workers, to help workers in Cambodia, because there's a lot of union, there's a lot of yellow union, there's a lot of kind of management union. That's why when the due diligence and then was focused only, for example, when I know that there's like focus on employers, but employee, for example, employee, I think it's not really enough, because when we talk about supply chain, it's not just only employee, but workers, you know, formal or informal worker in the supply chain, you know. In Cambodia, we have to careful with, I mean, with the word, you know, because it can be translated into a different way. And our example also was, I just want to share one of my example when I was with previous trade union. And then we have issue with Carlsberg. It is a beer company from Denmark. Yeah. There's a union over there, and then we file a case against them regarding to a right of beer promoter over there. And then they just claim that they talk to the union, but this is not a real union. It is just a management union. So that one of the problem. So I think it's really important. It's really important for due diligence to identify clearly in terms of worker and their union and also their rights to collective bargaining. I think this is that really important part that for due diligence, and it's really important, especially for country like Cambodia, like you know, in other Southeast Asia country, that the law or judicial system is not really strong, you know. So it's that benefit to the worker if yeah. So
good. There will be further questions for you. Okay, then I would turn to Lisa Nathan from Uni Global Union, and my questions to her are: how would it work in practice to have effective and meaningful stakeholder consultation? And what are the best tools that unions have developed to assist, and how can the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, ensure best practice? So for 5 minutes, yes.
Thanks very much, Heidi, and thank you very much to the organizers of the event and this really important discussion. Just to give a little bit of context of who we are, Uni Global Union is the Global Trade Union Federation for the services sectors. And so we represent 20 million workers across 150 different countries, and really at different levels of the value chain, from the top of the value chain to finance, where there's some questions in the directive, to retailers, but also security and cleaning and the different points. And I think this is the crux of what is one of the most important issues for us in the directive, because exactly as we've heard, I think if we don't have that really strong and specific language around the consultation of trade unions, meaningful engagement of trade unions at every single stage of that due diligence process, I think there's a real risk that we're going to not be able to achieve the aims of the directive that we really all want to see, I think, here in this room. And that need, I think, comes from what we've learned in practice. So even where laws have been in place, and that's a very huge step forward of due diligence legislation, we've seen that where it's not quite prescriptive enough, so in France, for example, that involvement hasn't typically taken place or hasn't taken place well enough. And so we have a real opportunity with the EU directive, I think, to move that forwards. And so as you raised in your questions, I think alongside getting that policy right, it's really crucial that we look to the practice and look at what we can do well, so that we can see how we can make sure that we're moving into that direction, as well as preparing ourselves to make the directive a reality. And so I think I'd highlight kind of two points of the positive. So firstly, that it's completely achievable, and we have these resources to really work with trade unions, to work with other stakeholders, to embed that in the due diligence process. But secondly, also that not only is it feasible, but it's also beneficial for all in the process, as you highlighted in the opening remarks as well. So recently, Uni Europa concluded a project supported by the European Commission to develop capacity and build awareness amongst trade union representatives here in Europe about how they could play an active role in human rights due diligence. And part of that was really breaking down and creating these resources, which we're very happy to have as resources that can be disseminated. And I think they apply to all sorts of different positions in the value chain quite widely, looking at what does good look like? Because I think that's where we need to start and be aiming for. And we have that set out in the international standards. We just need to break it down into practice. And so from that, we created a toolkit, online learning content, and a really simple checklist that can be used to break down what can sometimes be a little technical and abstract into something that could be taken into day-to-day. So, you know, looking at these very simple questions of who was actually involved in the process, how were they selected, what did that involvement look like, being able to answer those key questions, I think can really guide the process forward. And really, I think alongside that, then the question becomes, and that's what we try to provide in these resources, there's no reason that this can't be done. And so I think there's really two ways to do it. One way is we can proactively in our dialogue, for example, within trade unions with companies, seek to put it to the table with companies in our processes of negotiations, of dialogue, of information and consultation rights. But also where companies are failing to take those steps, we can play a role in driving improvements even in those contexts. For example, how can we work together across the labor movement to capture what those risks are that we know are the problems in Cambodia and Colombia, here in Europe, of those types of risks, and bring that to the table rather than the limitations that there are in social audits in that process. And there are quite established good practices that we can look to. Not to say, of course, all of these voluntary initiatives have clearly not been enough on their own, but it helps that it's not a pipe dream, that this can work well where we have examples. So to highlight a couple, we have binding global agreements where companies work together with their unions globally to respect fundamental labor rights, and including a due diligence process within that throughout all of those stages. We have models like the International Accord, or formerly Bangladesh Accord, that show through having that binding process, having local unions, global unions, NGOs, and the retailers and the suppliers involved, you can bring real change on the ground that the alternatives haven't really been able to deliver. And then I think finally, to turn back to the beneficial, and I'll stop there, we know that it can really, effective due diligence can mitigate those risks. And we know that that can't happen without the involvement of trade unions in the process. I think trade unions have that really unique role of knowing inside the company, but also knowing what's going on with workers' rights and being able to bring that to the table. And in contrast to the limitations of outside audits and third-party assessments, having workers organized and able to have a process to raise their voice is actually the best way to have an ongoing way to mitigate those human rights concerns, and do that in a preventative way rather than when something has gone wrong. I'll finish there.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. I think we really need to pay attention to the inclusion of even the latest ILO conventions on occupational safety and health, and make sure that these are an integral part of the basis for the duty of due diligence. Now, I would turn to Charlotte Seltus.
Yes, a very Dutch name.
Yeah, Seltus. And Charlotte is from the Social and Economic Council of the Netherlands. It's a sector initiative that supports Dutch companies in undertaking their due diligence duty. And you have accumulated quite a lot of experience. Yes. So we'd like to hear from you what you would give as an appropriate role for audits and sector initiatives, and what conditions should be fulfilled.
Yes, thank you, Heidi. We've actually had numerous discussions with Joseph already, so I'm happy to continue these today. But just to give maybe a broader perspective of the Social and Economic Council, we do a number of things. So we have, this is our history, but anyway, business, labor unions, and independent academic experts work together, and we do two things. We give advice to the government. We brought out an advice in 2021 on European RBC legislation, and also we facilitate the RBC agreements in a number of sectors, and which you can see also behind me. And these agreements, they promote RBC by a commitment to implement due diligence according to the OECD guidelines and the UNGPs, and they involve a partnership between business, trade associations, government, unions, and NGOs all at the table. And what I would like to do today, I mean, there's so much that I can share and tell you, but I try to focus on a number of things and lessons that we learned that we feel are key to make CSDD work, and also in the realization that we don't know everything yet. But first of all, we believe that there needs to be more focus on meaningful stakeholder dialogue. And I think the panelists and I all agree on there. So what we do in the agreements is that we guide companies step by step through their due diligence process. And what we have seen is that companies that only use audits to get insight in their risks and in their supply chain do not actually know what's going on. So if the role of audits is over-exaggerated within the legislation, you are more likely to encourage falsification and cover-up of what is actually going on, rather than promoting cooperation and transparency and improvement within the supply chain. So audit should be a means to a goal and not a goal in itself. And so what we have done, for example, within the agreement is that a number of companies have given their audit results to CSOs, to unions, to them, and asked them to read along with them with the outcomes and help them to flag certain things within the audits, to actually have the conversation with their supplier to actually, understand what is going on and where they need to take action. And we feel that meaningful stakeholder dialogue is so it's key for, for companies to know what's actually going on. At the same time, we also encountered a number of problems to actually facilitate this meaningful dialogue between companies and CSO. And the main thing was for us that a safe and enabling environment, but also sufficient capacity is often lacking at local stakeholder or for local stakeholders to actually do their work. So we also feel that it is necessary for the CSDD and also for other EU policies to support civil society capacity building in the global south, so that trade unions and NGOs actually have the capacity to be consulted and to help companies do their due diligence. So I think that these accompanying measurements will be crucial for due diligence legislation to actually function. Then secondly, legislation should incentivize companies to join sectoral agreements. And I think that Joseph and I differ in this perspective. So what we see is that sectoral agreements have a huge potential in assisting companies in actually doing their due diligence and making it practical. The law is going to pertain high over very generally formulated standards, and they need clarification in practice. For example, what does it mean for me as a company to do good due diligence in, I don't know, the clothing sector in Turkey on freedom of association? And also by hashing this out with all these different stakeholders together, sectoral agreements can develop and standardize best practices in these areas where there maybe they're not. As you just said, there are a lot of best practices, and sometimes there are no best practices. I'm thinking about forced labor in China, for example, in Xinjiang. What do we do? And what we also see is that sectoral agreements can help supervisory bodies in installing a lighter supervisory priority for those companies that join sectoral agreements, because we have had numerous of conversations with these supervisory bodies, and the tasks is simply too big, so they need help in carrying out their responsibility in that respect. It should be said that this should be done without the sectoral agreement being a safe harbor, and it should also not be a proxy for compliance. And so companies remain responsible individually for doing their own due diligence. And then maybe my last point, and then I'm rounding off, I think it's also important for the European Commission and for member states to play a role and to achieve this. I think the European Commission should facilitate and help implement negotiated European sectoral agreements, which follow the OECD guidelines and UNGPs, preferably multi-stakeholder. They need to be complemented by certain measures, as I just said. And also, I think in addition to legislation, governments should also lead by own example and start with their sustainable public procurement.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Since you challenged a little bit Joe, and I think you partly agree, you partly disagree. So Joe, perhaps very briefly, would you like to clarify your position vis-a-vis what?
Well, I'll just make it very clear where we agree and where we don't agree, and why we don't agree. So I think where we do agree is that in some cases, certainly sector initiatives and auditing and certifications can help companies do due diligence and understand the risks. They can provide a way to engage with stakeholders. But the problem is, just like the OECD guidelines suggest that companies can use these, the problem is when you get to requiring them or sort of providing some sort of a lighter enforcement regime onto an initiative that will not be tested in terms of their impact on the ground. If you're going to sort of pre-select for companies, it sort of breaks the entire logic of due diligence that should be risk-based, not based on some sort of pre-selected criteria of policies or paper. But if the regulators and the judges look at the impacts on the ground, companies themselves will sort of logically migrate, I think, to the initiatives that do help them. And if you start getting into a situation where you're pre-selecting certain certification schemes, certain multi-stakeholder initiatives, certain auditors, again, you're sort of creating this paper reality that is going to, I think, both waste regulators and judges and auditors' time, and also create a big risks for workers and for communities who, we've seen just time after time that where even situations, even certification schemes, even multi-stakeholder initiatives that look good on paper don't actually deliver in many cases for the workers.
Thank you very much. And thank you for coining this concept of paper reality. We have been speaking about tick the box exercise, but we can now speak about paper reality as well. But then as a last thing, my curiosity is about countries where the conditions indeed are very, very demanding for labor unions and for any kind of participation. So I would like to ask Sar something about how do you think European and let's say companies from the end destination countries of the products from Cambodia, how do you think they actually manage? Do they have leverage towards this one-party system of Hun Sen, which is really very, very tough? And we know that they should not be rewarded for anything that they do at the moment. But what can the companies do? What do they have leverage, or do they not have leverage?
Yes, actually, like I said, the country like Cambodia, the judicial system is not work for the poor, for working people, So our experience, in my experience in the last 20 years as a trade union is, whenever, situation of worker, when conflict or abuse was happen, we cannot go to the Cambodian judicial system. We talk to brand who can talk to employers to improve working condition, to solve the problem what's happening in the workplace. And I know like in Europe and in America, brand was listen, or they care about their customer. So that's why they have to think, to take action, to do something, to show they are commit something, do better, So that how the situation was in Cambodia is like that. That's why it's still it's really important that I also like one thing, like there was a leader of a labor organization was sued by the Cambodian government, and while all brand from Europe, from America, they send a letter to Cambodian government, they also will drop the case, Yeah, so this still leverage. To pressure to change situation for Cambodia. And I know it's hard for now. Like the Hun Sen government, he want to transfer. He want to transfer to his son, to continuing ruling the country, and then he don't want to listen to any, international community, but it's still, I think it's still really important, at least we have Cambodian people have more time to learn, or to rising awareness, to do something more,
Yes. Thank you. So this is a good example of the need of interaction of different players together. And there can be leverage indeed, where companies sometimes say that they cannot do anything. So now it's time to conclude this panel. I think it became very obvious that the multi-stakeholder initiatives and certifications and the like can serve as it's like helping tools, but they should never replace the duty of due diligence, which is a thing in itself, and we have to define it well in the legislation. So thank you very much, Joe, Sar, Lisa, and Charlotte. We will change the speakers and the moderator. I see that my colleague has arrived, so thank you very much, and we move on to the question of the value chain.
To the next panel. So we're doing very well on time, and this panel is all that stands between you and a very well-deserved lunch. So we'll continue to be prompt in our answers and hopefully lend some clarity to this area. So my name is Barry Andrews. I'm the rapporteur on the CSDD file in the Trade Committee. We have some areas of competence, quite limited, despite battles lost and won over the last 6 months. But we got our proposal through the committee, which was, I think, very balanced. Actually, would be described as progressive. The EPP didn't vote for it. We lost one of our own in the battle as well. So it sort of indicates the direction of travel a little bit. So we have some great experts here. I'm really anxious to hear from them, as I'm sure you are. So I think we'll just get straight into letting them tell us their experiences. And particularly the focus here is on value chain and the scope of the value chain. So we're hoping to get specific insights here. I know that those that are trying to limit or even stop the proposal, the legislation, are putting together examples of how complex, bureaucratic, and difficult the measure will be for businesses across Europe. And so the contrary exercise has to take place for those who want to see it happen, to try to provide examples of why it is so important. So hopefully today we'll get into that. So our first speaker is Natalie Swan, who is the Labour Rights Programme Manager at the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre based in London. And Natalie, I'll give you the floor. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Barry. And what I'm going to do in 5 minutes is, I think, link from the previous panel to the Resource Centre's approach to stakeholder engagement, and then shift that to the chain and the scope. So we know that CSDDD will engage and impact on a broad range of stakeholders and a broad range of businesses as well across the EU. And a large part of what we do at the Resource Centre is to work on monitoring companies and their activities in relation to human rights and environmental rights abuse, and then reaching out to those businesses to ask them how they'll investigate and mitigate these risks, and importantly, provide remedy for workers. And whilst we do see companies engaging with what we would call the correct stakeholders, right? Trade unions, worker representatives. All too often we hear from companies when we reach out to them regarding an abuse in their supply chain, the answer is less than ideal, let's say. And just to give you an example of some of the work we were doing last week in relation to Myanmar and garment supply chains, in that really high risk area at the moment, there were labour rights abuses in a factory in Myanmar around payment of wages, around freedom of association. And we said, well, how are you investigating it? And the response from the company is, well, we asked the Labour Inspectorate to come and investigate the issue, and they say there's no problem. The Labour Inspectorate is linked to the military junta, who is persecuting the workers for engaging in their right to organise at work. So we know that currently there isn't that imperative for all companies to undertake heightened due diligence, correct due diligence, and they're not necessarily scared to tell us how they're underperforming in relation to due diligence publicly when we ask them questions about it. So at the Resource Centre, we thought, right, we need to open this conversation up and talk to different types of stakeholders and show how they need to be centred in any new directive. So what we've been doing over the last few months is going to workers across the value chain in the global south, talking to worker representatives, talking to trade unions, because we know that workers are the experts on what is happening in the ground, in their workplaces, where the health and safety risks are, why workers aren't being paid enough to provide a good livelihood for themselves and their families. So we've been talking to workers in Cambodia, in India, and later this month or next month, across the African continent as well, on what they think is really important to be included in this emerging legislative framework. So colleagues have already talked about the stakeholder piece, which of course we feel is vital. What I'm going to focus on for the next couple of minutes rather is the chain and the imperative for this new directive to reflect the realities of supply chains, not the perfect supply chains we would want to see, not the easy to reach parts of supply chains, but the kind of gnarly realities that's a wide and massive geographical footprint across the globe, into the global south in particular, where workers are making goods, where services are being provided for EU consumers, right? So there's a few key points I want to raise, which is firstly that there needs to be a risk-based approach. We already heard from Joseph. It's convenient to sometimes look at the higher tiers of the supply chain. It's not reflecting the realities of supply chains, and importantly, where the highest risk work and impacts of business activities are. Looking at the garment sector, which is a huge focus for us at the Resource Centre, we know that subcontracting is pervasive. Informal work is pervasive. Piecework leading all the way into people's houses, not even onto the factory floor, is pervasive. And we believe that if the directive does not cover these types of works, these areas of the supply chains, then it's not going to do the job of identifying human rights and environmental risks, and importantly, mitigating and eliminating it. So that's the first thing. There needs to be a risk-based approach. Where's the highest risk of your supply chain? Investigate there, put your resources there, rather than focus on the, let's say, low-hanging fruit that we see. Lots of companies definitely focusing on at the moment. The second piece I wanted to raise is this established business relationships pieces that I think was there in the initial proposed directive. And I think hopefully that's slightly being watered down and we're seeing a post-established business relationship reality. What workers told us in India and Cambodia is that established business relationships don't always exist, that buyers in the garment sector are privileging short-term contracts, very mobile contracts with suppliers. And therefore, if the definition was established business relationships, so many factories, so many workplaces, so many areas of risk would be left out of this directive. There's also this perverse reality that could be created whereby businesses loosen their relationships across the supply chain to therefore not have to cover it. Very lastly, transparency. The work of the Resource Centre, of unionists like Samora, cannot be undertaken if we don't know what's going on in supply chains. Supply chains are complicated, they're long. It's businesses that know what's happening in their own supply chain. Therefore, they need to make public that mapping of their supply chain. They need to make public the result of audit reports. To an extent, they need to make public the contracts they have with suppliers. So workers can say, well, you know, you need to have a longer contract, or why have you stopped working with these workers? Why have you stopped building a sustainable relationship with this supplier? So we think that what's currently missing from the directive is not just the incorporation of the length of the chain, but the fact that we need to know what that chain actually looks like to hold businesses accountable. And that's a real opportunity that this directive could bring that I think currently is missing.
Just about to intervene. That was brilliant, brilliantly well timed. So let me just introduce the next speaker. Diraj works for the Indian NGO Praxis India. He's directly engaged with communities in the area of gender equality, sustainable livelihoods and access to rights and entitlements. And for the last 7 years, he's been researching on disclosures and policy commitments on top listed companies in India. And he was part of the principal research team of India Responsible Business Index. I should have let you use, oh no, you have your own microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think because we are here talking about the chain itself, so would be good if, okay, I think slide is not there. There was one slide where basically we have to look at the complexity of the chain itself. So what ought to happen that mostly when we talk of audits or any certification, it kind of picks up the easiest part of this chain, which is already known to us. And that's the information that kinds of feeds back to us. So when we talk about the entire auditing system, what workers are talking about, that let's have more investment directly with the supply chain rather than on certifications. Because what tends to happen, most of the resources go to auditing system rather than being invested into the actual supply chain, which puts them further at a loss. Second is the question about the ownership itself. So though we are talking about the downstream accountability, but what is happening on the upstream in terms of the accountability? Do we know how brands are earning or what is happening with that profit? So can there be a system where brands can disclose that what is being spent on inclusion, and if that can be disaggregated at the level of value chain at various levels? So we know how much is going into inclusion at the downstream level and into this complex part of the supply chain. Third part was about the grievance redressal, because if something is happening with the worker in this complex supply chain, where will the worker go? Are we expecting that worker will come to any redressal or legal system which is based out of global north? It will be very difficult. So are we able to create supportive systems, particularly looking at maybe free legal aid kind of support systems where role of trade unions is clearly defined, because that is where most of the workers are going right now for their redressal. So can we have a more proactive role for trade unions in this entire system? Then talking of this complexity, next comes the question of gender and caste and its intersectionality when we are talking of Indian context, because there's already a defined social hierarchy. If we look at the data, we clearly know that as we move down the value chain, it is being populated by workers coming from disadvantaged identities. So is any one solution may not work for all realities in global south. So in this particular case, we have to look at caste realities, how women workers coming from the Dalit community will have their voices in this system. So somewhere that reality also needs to be taken care of. So these are the various complexities. Overall, the question that I raised earlier was of the ownership. Who is responsible in this? Is it about the supplier in the global south or the brands in the global north? Who is more powerful in this relationship and who will take the onus? Second is also about the role of the state in this. We have seen that brands tend to circumvent when it comes to taking responsibilities. So can states in global north can take that role? Can there be taxation on companies and that fund can be used to establish these due diligence systems which are convened or which are kind of mandated by the state and monitored by the state directly? And last, I think what Natalie was already speaking about is in terms of disclosure. So let's map the value chain and make it public. Let's disclose it first, and then we can talk about how more stringent systems can be there. Thank you.
Okay, Dheeraj, thank you very much for that opening remark. And our next speaker is Maria Pia Bianchetti of UNICEF, who is a program specialist, child rights and business at UNICEF. Previously, she was senior specialist of child rights at the UK Committee for UNICEF, where she led the work on the impact of the business sector on child rights, advocating for better legislation. So the floor is yours. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Barry. And and thank you everyone for inviting me to speak on this panel. We know that the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive offers a unique opportunity to make sustainability and respect for human rights and child rights a standard business practice. And so we need to make sure that it works for everyone and also it works specifically for children. So for more than 10 years, since the launch of the Children's Rights and Business Principles, UNICEF has been working both with community and businesses in sourcing countries, with companies in the global north, to identify adverse impacts on children, but also ways to integrate child rights into their due diligence. And we've also worked with governments to translate all these lessons into advice for policy and legislation on responsible business practice. So from this experience, there are two critical lessons that are relevant for today's panel. The first one is that legislations and due diligence mechanisms that are not designed taking into consideration the rights and needs of children and other groups in vulnerable situations are likely going to fail to identify and address specific impacts on them. The second one is that while child labor in supply chains is the most widely recognized negative impact, business impacts on children's rights occur at every stage of the value chain, both in upstream and downstream activities. So when companies narrowly focus their human rights due diligence just into the supply chain or limited parts of the downstream activities, they miss on significant impacts on children, and which means that those impacts remain unaddressed. So some of the examples of these impacts that I'm talking about are, for example, child labor in e-waste, online violence, health and well-being impacts deriving from irresponsible marketing practices. So picking one specific example, marketing and advertising, we know can promote positive behaviors, positive models, but irresponsible practices can affect children's health, well-being, and development. So marketing and advertising of unhealthy food has been linked with childhood obesity, and unhealthy weight in childhood has been linked with an increased risk of non-communicable diseases, such as heart disease, diabetes, and cancers, but also with psychological and psychosocial impacts, such as weight stigma, social isolation, depression, and poor educational attainment. And children are more exposed to unhealthy foods marketing than adults, and especially those living in lower socioeconomic groups tend to be more exposed through magazines, television, placement and frequency of fast food outlets. But also marketing and advertising can perpetrate harmful and discriminatory stereotypes, which affect children's confidence, aspirations, health, including mental health, and can restrict children from opportunities, especially those who are in a marginalized and situations of exclusion. So marketing and advertising would be one of those practices that fall into the scope of downstream activities. So a full value chain due diligence will cover also these activities as well, which means that companies will have to assess the negative impacts that their marketing and advertising approaches have on people, but also adopt more responsible marketing and advertising approaches, meaning having clear policy commitments, clear principles around marketing to children, providing guidance and building the capacity of their employees and their workers, meaning designing campaigns that have in mind respect for children's rights, but also assessing their product regularly throughout the creative process. So if the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive integrates a full value chain due diligence approach, one that also integrates a requirement for companies to pay attention to the rights and needs of children and other groups in vulnerable situations, it can ensure that impacts on children in downstream activities are also identified by companies and tackled by companies. These are impacts that otherwise a narrow focus would remain unaddressed. And we know that some companies are already adopting a full value chain approach. And so the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, by adopting a full value chain approach, will be able to accelerate this company practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that outline. And our final speaker is online is Gabrielle Holly, who is from the Danish Institute for Human Rights. And Gabrielle leads the Institute's work on legal and regulatory developments relevant to fostering business respect for human rights. And she's published a considerable amount of research in supply chains, mandatory due diligence laws, and the implementation of the smart mix. So Gabrielle, thank you very much for joining us. And I think you're with us and the floor is yours if you can hear us.
Yes, thanks, Barry. Hopefully you can hear me.
We can hear you. Maybe if you could be small, but just hold on a second, Gabrielle. We'll try and get the sound a little bit louder. Just one moment, if you could.
Sure.
Good. Okay. Okay, go ahead, Gabrielle. I think we should have you now.
Okay, super. Thank you, Barry. And I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person for this excellent event. I think I can build on Maria Pia's last remark and note that there is solid business practice in conducting due diligence in the downstream. So our specialist business and human rights team at the Institute has now done a number of direct engagements with companies in the past, and we currently facilitate a network of Nordic businesses on human rights. And we, of course, draw learnings from those engagements in our work. And in the past year or so, we've been focusing in particular on what it means to do human rights due diligence in the downstream part of the value chain. And based on that, what I would say is that it's not only feasible, it's already being done. Last week, we published a report, which is detailed on this slide, containing a number of real-world case studies from companies across a range of sectors and contexts, from consumer goods to pharma to tech to renewable energy to transport and logistics, all of whom shared how they do downstream due diligence. As noted on the slide, we were given examples by Novo Nordisk, Reckitt, Maersk, Vestas, Ericsson, and Pandora, very different companies in very different sectors, all of whom take a value chain approach to their due diligence. We develop case studies by conducting interviews with these companies, as well as being informed by a closed roundtable for business we facilitated last year. Many companies participating expressed a desire to do more and engage more with downstream due diligence, but expressed at the same time some frustration at the lack of clear guidance. I should also note that a number of the companies who gave us case studies and who participated in that roundtable noted that the full value chain approach in the Commission's proposal for a due diligence law had helped them to secure internal buy-in and escalate efforts to address downstream impacts. And this is momentum that should be harnessed rather than discouraged. And what the case studies show is we're not starting from scratch here. There are more developed practices in certain sectors acknowledged generally to have higher risks of severe impacts in the downstream, such as tech, as well as widely used processes not addressed specifically at human rights that can nonetheless be adapted. So I think it's useful to draw a few specific examples from the publication. So from Novo Nordisk, we hear about how know your customer and anti-bribery and corruption risk processes can be adapted to include consideration of human rights impacts in the downstream, including impacts on patients and end users. The Reckitt example shows how undertaking a full value chain human rights impact assessment, as they did on 2 of their product lines in the Thai context, Durex condoms and Enfa infant formula, can help them understand the impacts they have on consumers and develop actions to address risk and both actively promote human rights in the national context. I should say this, of course, included impacts on children, as Maria Pia mentioned. They were specifically considered given the Enfa infant formula focus. The Ericsson example shows how responsible sales processes can include human rights considerations and how mitigation measures can be developed in the context of B2B relationships. The Pandora example shows how approaches to responsible marketing can be developed, even in as complicated a space as digital marketing, to ensure respect for human rights, and again, including focus on children's rights. From Maersk, we hear about their approach to responsible ship recycling and how they've engaged with local shipbreaking yards to elevate health and safety standards and engage with local communities. And finally, from Vestas, we hear about their social due diligence tool and how they engage with customers and other stakeholders, including embedding personnel to work with community liaison officers in mega wind projects to which they supply wind turbines. So what these examples show is that there are already a number of existing very familiar processes which can be adapted to consider human rights impacts. Each of these companies takes a full value chain approach to their due diligence, acknowledging they have impacts in the upstream and the downstream. So in the publication, we've tried to present a fair assessment of what it means to do due diligence in the downstream, acknowledging, of course, that conversations around downstream due diligence in this part of the value chain are at an earlier stage than those around the supply chain. We try to demystify some of the core concepts, cover what the international frameworks expect, which is full value chain due diligence, as the UNGPs and OECD guidelines state. We cover what kinds of human rights impacts are likely to arise in the downstream and emerging practices for addressing them from the case studies. We don't shy away from acknowledging that there are challenges here. The kinds of human rights impacts that a company might need to consider in this part of the value chain is likely to be broader than that considered in the context of the supply chain, which is often confined to consideration of labor rights. And this necessitates a different approach and maybe a degree of capacity building. However, as the case studies show, this is steadily becoming ordinary course of business. And what we need is to escalate efforts here to scale these emerging good practices. This means developing means for companies to learn from each other, but critically supporting these efforts by clear authoritative guidance, which should include coherent regulation. We hope that this report can help clarify actual business practices for policymakers engaged in the discussion around the scope of the law. We often hear that companies aren't ready for this, but what I hope we've shown through this report is that they're well on their way And these efforts should be supported rather than stifled by the development of regulation. Thanks. I'll hand back the floor.
Thank you, Gabrielle. That's very clear. While you have the floor, if I could just ask a question. We're all familiar with downstream cases that have been taken. In other words, litigation that has been triggered for downstream cases. Where the supply chain is concerned. Has your research come across any examples of litigation in relation to, or sorry, the other way around, I'm always confused, in relation to the value chain, the type of cases that the type of circumstances you've just been describing, and maybe also Maria might have a comment on that as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, our report focuses very much on what companies are doing in terms of policy and process to manage these kinds of impacts. But of course, there's been litigation. I mean, you've seen, of course, a number of cases in the US context brought against Purdue and other retailers and corporate advisors in the context of the Oxycontin crisis. But there hasn't been that much that we've seen in the kind of European context. There is some emerging case law in the UK, such as a case brought in the Begum and Moran case, which is some litigation brought against an intermediary who sold a ship to be recycled in a Bangladeshi shipyard under conditions which led to death. But these are very outlier cases. And I think that often there's this kind of concern around expanding value chain scope leading to this increased risk of litigation. And I think that's often quite overstated. And I think that you can very capably design a civil liability mechanism that includes appropriate kind of controls to make sure that no company is liable for everything up and down the value chain, while at the same time encouraging companies to really identify and address their risks, wherever there might be at whatever point in the value chain. So I think that these concerns around legal risk are a little bit overstated, and that there is no legal system which allows liability for absolutely everything. There are always guardrails around reasonableness, foreseeability. All of these things can be built into something. And so I think that while there is a focus on the negative cases, and I think that's certainly a factor to be considered, I think it's more useful to focus on the positive processes that can be undertaken to manage these kinds of risks, and then thereby avoiding litigation in the first place.
And I'm kind of intrigued by the Nordic businesses, because we got a representation from IKEA, another Nordic business, who gave the example of fiberboard, which is obviously a key ingredient in much of the furniture that we've all struggled with in our front rooms over the years. And it is made of an aggregate which comes from shavings and offcuts and from places that IKEA doesn't know anything about, and then it goes into the supply chain to traders, and traders bring it into various manufacturing places where IKEA finally buy it from, and they say, well, how are we supposed to know about the bit at the end? And yet, I mean, the revolutionary thing about due diligence is, while businesses are always mapping their supply chain, insofar as there may be a risk to the business, now they have to map supply chain and value chain insofar as they have a risk to human rights. So they have this information because it's mission critical that fiberboard is a key ingredient in thousands of products that IKEA make, and they must know the process that brings fiberboard into their factories, and they must therefore have visibility of these. Diraj, maybe you could comment about that, because you really drawn attention to that, the most vulnerable in the entire chain. And I think we're 10 years after Rana Plaza. It's almost exactly to the day. And maybe if you could give us some specific examples of this kind of vulnerability, because your companies are trying to push this away, saying it's too remote, it's beyond their capacity to fully certify these chains.
We can talk about garment sector itself, like how the work gets kind of distributed whenever any garment product is made. So each component is going to different small and medium enterprise. Then that enterprise is giving it to the group of workers or group of contractors. And even though contractors are giving it to the set of home workers to make it. So that is the complexity of the chain itself. And many times we end up at the level of packaging, where packaging takes place. And that's where the due diligence is taking place where we are mapping the chain, or we are mapping the risks or vulnerabilities. Best thing would be to, that's why kind of groups were emphasizing on having more participation from trade unions and workers, because they know this entire chain itself and where it goes and where it comes from. So if we start looking at workers and trade unions more as an experts, I would say, rather than as recipients of this entire system of where we are not doing something good for you, but we are engaging with you. We are creating a system to learn more about how it is. Because this, there was also one particular aspect related to punitive action that was pointed out, that workers said we need business to out of it. It's not that we are saying you stop your contracts or start kind of acting in a punitive approach. So that's where workers had this demand that, can we think of this together? Can we look at these chains together, see which are the most risky chains? And even these chains, there are many workers who are out of these complex supply chains. If we look at service sector or gig workers, or even these workers who are providing services, they are not even falling in this chain itself, but they are at the highest risk when it comes to these supply chains, because, and there's no established business relationship in that particular case.
Okay.
So that's where I think go-to workers, they will have best answers to this.
There's one final question I'll put to all of them, and we'll each of the panelists, and refer to them, all of them, as to each of the panelists, which is a collective question. Maybe they've thought about, which is how to win the argument on this. I mean, I think we're probably talking to a specific group here, but there is a big argument coming, and we're talking about the human rights due diligence. There's the environmental due diligence, and you hear some people say, well, that's where you should fight the battle on environment because people respond to that better. How do we describe the cases? How do we put the positive aspects of due diligence on the table? Not constantly be negative about the things that have happened, but how this can create a positive narrative for businesses and how rewarding. I think Gabrielle made that point very well in her opening comments. But winning the argument, getting the narrative right, where is this battle going to be won and lost as far as this discussion is happening over the next few months? Would you mind starting on that? Thank you.
Sure. If I owned a business in 2023, I would want a resilient supply chain that I had oversight of, and I would want to know who was making the goods that I'm selling. And I think really the solution to that is to have a partnership approach across supply chains. It's been mentioned by Diraj, I mentioned it myself. Workers are the experts. They can tell you where the problems are before your auditor even comes in, and not just prevent human rights abuses, labor rights abuses occurring, but ensure that as a business, you're able to stay open. You don't have all of these unexpected problems arising in the supply chain. And as we know that supply chains are increasingly perilous in, for example, garment producing areas, you have floods in Pakistan, a political problem in Myanmar, anti kind of trade union legislation in many areas of Asia. You want to make sure that you're having the right conversations in these hotspot areas to preempt problems and develop resilient supply chains. And I think the answer to that is partnership and expertise with workers.
I think I have already emphasized on this point, but just one thing, I think it's about the pursuit from we know everything to we need to know more, or we don't know the reality yet. And that's where due diligence systems are failing, because this whole idea around certification pushes, like you're certifying this is working well, while knowing that there's a lot that is not working well. So that pursuit needs to change somewhere in that entire system.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, again, like, as you were pointing out, due diligence is about preventing, it's like preventing impacts. And in order to prevent adverse impacts, you need to know what are those impacts that you might or you are causing. So I think really emphasizing this aspect of due diligence is really critical. And that's why a value chain approach better equips businesses to know what's happening and what can happen in their value chain.
And the final word, Gabrielle.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the question, because I think that, there are three arguments that I commonly hear against including the downstream in this regulatory initiative. Firstly, legal certainty, that it's too vague and companies won't know where their responsibilities end. And to that, I would say we have over a decade of company practice implementing the expectations of the UNGPs and OECD guidelines on which this proposal is based. And frankly, the approach in the law should match current company practice. And what we've tried to do through this report is show what current company practice is here, which is a risk-based approach. Secondly, we often hear that companies aren't ready for this. And again, I would say the case studies clearly show that companies are already doing this. There are processes in place which can be leveraged here. Also, this initiative is only going to apply to the very largest companies. And I think that they are ones who have the most capacity to properly engage with impacts in this part of the downstream value chain. And thirdly, as we touched on very briefly earlier, this litigation risk question, the idea that if we expand due diligence to the whole of the value chain, that this will somehow expose companies to a greater degree of risk. Again, I think this can be very well managed by a proper design of a civil liability mechanism, which should speak to the content of the due diligence obligation. Due diligence should be broader. Companies should be having regard to the whole value chain, and liability risk should be necessarily narrower. And I think that there are ways that can be built in there. So I think those are the three arguments that I typically hear against expanding the scope of due diligence in this way. And I think those are the counter arguments I would pose anyway.
Excellent. Okay, I think that's a very clear summary. We have, as mentioned at the very beginning, it's about partnership with businesses and to try to demonstrate the benefits that flow to that there's an actual competitive market value to doing this and doing this well. And we have research and evidence that demonstrates that. I'm sure all of us will look to see a bit more into that research, and because this is the only way we're going to win this argument, actually. In the months ahead. So look, let me on your behalf thank all of the panelists, and we will take a short break, 10 minutes, a 10-minute break before we resume. So just there's some light refreshments, and if you come back at 28 minutes past to be precise.
All right, I think we are we have sufficient quorum to start. Good afternoon. My name is Lina Wendland. I'm the head of business and human rights in the UN Human Rights Office. And we from OECD-Watch, UN Human Rights. So we have followed the discussions around the Corporate Sustainability Directive from the outset. As you imagine, we have a very strong interest in promoting a piece of regulation that is aligned with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. We've made several public submissions, so I won't go through all our positioning on that, but just refer you to the documents that is available on the OECD-Watch website. But as I said, our point of departure is that in order to realize the full potential of a piece of regulation and milestone regulation like this, is that it needs to be aligned with the relevant international standards. So from our perspective, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, but of course also the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. And we do work quite closely with the OECD in our approach to providing input to the process. We are particularly concerned with Pillar 3, with access to remedy, sort of embedding the access to remedy into the directive, and we're doing that on the basis of the 9-year project that we call the Accountability and Remedy Project, that we have been mandated by the UN Human Rights Council since 2014 to report, to prepare additional guidance and policy recommendations on how to more effectively enhance access to remedy through both state-based and non-state-based mechanisms as part of the implementation of the UN guiding principles. And indeed, our public submissions in the context of the CS3D has been drawn on based on all the work and resources that we have developed as part of the Accountability and Remedy Project. I should mention that the project has been strongly supported by the European Union and European Union member states,
and our reports have been welcomed by consensus by the Human Rights Council. So we feel that in terms of the political support for the kind of submissions we have, if you're talking from a policy coherence perspective, there should be some alignment. To turn to the panel and sorry for apologies for abusing the position of chair, just to talk a little bit about the project, but we have this great panel to illustrate why this matters. And it's not just a theoretical issue, it is indeed a topic that we need to ensure the Directive gets right, and we have this panel to provide a number of concrete examples, that illustrates both the relevance and the urgency of getting it right. We need to make sure that all the efforts that we are engaged in here have impact where it really matters, namely in the lives of people, and we'll get here some very important examples of exactly that. So I will start with giving the floor to Anna Levia. And when Anna is going to speak, you need to put on your earphones. And I'm told you shouldn't touch anything. You should just put them on, and then it should work. But Anna is Deputy Director of the Peruvian NGO Cooperación Peru. Anna is a legal specialist in mining and environmental cases, land use planning, citizen participation, and prior consultation. So Anna, the question for you, as someone who's working directly on the ground as regards the Repsol oil spill case in Peru. So again, we're going into very concrete, real cases here to illustrate the points. Can you tell us a bit about the need for access to justice improvements from your professional experience in this case? And if you can kindly stay to 5 minutes. We're a little bit behind time, so we'll end a little bit just after 2. But Anna, you have the floor. Thank you.
Buenas tardes con todos y con todas. Es un gusto estar aquí. Creo que traigo el caso de Repsol. Sí. Buenas tardes. Les decía, traigo el caso de Repsol para compartirlo, para ilustrar la importancia que tiene una directiva sobre debida diligencia para todos, ¿no? En el mundo. Entonces, quiero compartirles el caso. El año pasado, el 15 de enero del 2022, hubo 2 derrames de petróleo en un mismo día, y durante la transferencia de petróleo de un barco carguero a un terminal que tenía tanques de almacenamiento, y de la refinería La Pampilla, de la multinacional Repsol, y se derramaron en estos dos derrames que hubieron, uno a las 5:19 y otro a las 10:51 de la noche. Se derramaron más de 10,000 barriles de petróleo en las costas del Callao, y esto se extendió al litoral limeño, ¿no? La empresa reportó solamente el derrame de 16% de un solo barril, ¿no? O sea, habiendo sido derramado 10,000, más de 10,000, reportó el derrame de solo un barril, 16% de un barril, y 2.5 de extensión de la mancha, metros, 2.5 metros de afectación, de zona afectada, ¿no? Entonces, porque como no reportó minimizando el hecho, la emergencia fue catalogada como de nivel 1, y entonces, y no de nivel 3 como correspondía, y eso limitó la respuesta. Entonces no tuvo una respuesta adecuada, y esto se convirtió en un desastre ambiental. Y el derrame, la mancha de petróleo se expandió en 100 kilómetros, afectando el ecosistema marino costero, 2 áreas de reserva natural y los medios de vida de más de 10,000 personas. Aún año del derrame, el área afectada no ha sido adecuadamente limpiada ni recuperada, ¿no? Las playas todavía permanecen cerradas y no existe un inventario ni una valorización de daños. No se ha publicado ningún documento que permita determinar una reparación ambiental y social justa. Sin embargo, a pesar de que no existe esta identificación y cuantificación de daños, se vienen haciendo o realizando transacciones extrajudiciales con los afectados, ¿no? Sin una información básica para negociar. Entonces están a expensas de lo que diga la empresa, ¿no? La empresa pone el monto y no hay nada que discutir. Entonces, también quería señalarles que este no es un hecho aislado en el Perú. Ya hay más de 1000 derrames de petróleo que han venido ocurriendo los últimos 25 años, más de 100.000 barriles derramados, ¿no? 2/3 de estos derrames han sido por fallas operativas y por falta de mantenimiento en ductos. Entonces, lamentablemente, esta es una realidad que demuestra la debilidad institucional que tenemos y las dificultades que tenemos también para el acceso a la justicia, para que estas situaciones no se repitan, se vienen repitiendo año a año y por lo tanto, por eso miramos con tanta expectativa a una directiva sobre debida diligencia de la Unión Europea, ¿no? Que permita hacer posible o reclamar derechos humanos y la protección del ambiente. Nosotros, hay muchas asimetrías, muchas desigualdades en el Perú y sentimos que es necesaria una regulación internacional que establezca obligaciones directas y obligaciones extraterritoriales en las multinacionales, ¿no? Sobre temas de derechos humanos y ambiente y que incluya también el tema de cambio climático, las obligaciones respecto a temas climáticos y de uso sostenible de los recursos naturales. También consideramos que es muy importante, muy necesaria que esta directiva incluya para la prevención y para la reparación la participación de los afectados o de los interesados. Nos parece sumamente importante porque para llegar a establecer planes, ¿no? O reparaciones que sean satisfactorias, porque sin ello es bien difícil, ¿no? Porque a veces dice ya se plantea algo que no va a resolver el problema realmente. Entonces es importante, muy importante que en los planes que van a permitir prevenir este tipo de desastres y también en las reparaciones los afectados participen, ¿no? También pensamos que es bien importante que las barreras se enfrenten las barreras de acceso a la justicia, ¿no? Es importante que, por ejemplo, se incorpore la cadena de valor, porque ahí eso es un límite, ¿no? Es importante que, por ejemplo, el sector financiero, ¿no? También pueda ser parte, sea incluido en la directiva, y que también haya mecanismos que se faciliten para el acceso a la justicia, mecanismos claros que permitan el acceso a la justicia, también que los impactos diferenciados también se identifiquen, no solamente sean impactos generales, sino también el impacto sobre las mujeres, por ejemplo, ¿no? Y otro tema que nos parece central de establecer es el tema de la inversión de la carga de la prueba, ¿no? Porque los afectados suelen tener mucha dificultad para conseguir los elementos probatorios de las vulneraciones. Entonces, y ahí sí que la carga de la prueba se invierta y que lo tenga que hacer la empresa, eso facilitaría el acceso a la justicia de los afectados, ¿no? Creo que me estoy excediendo. Muchas gracias.
No, thanks, Anna. It was really important to get your perspective and to illustrate how important it is to have effective access to justice in the directive and beyond, I should add, but really interesting. And thanks for sharing those also proposals around overcoming the barriers that are so present in the work that you're doing. So thanks a lot for that. I will now pass on the floor to Robert McCorkadale. Robert has a long and illustrative experience in the access of on the issue of access to justice, access to remedy. But for today, I'll limit my introduction of him to say that he's here as a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. So access to justice, Robert, is, as you know very well, it's a systemic problem that the guiding principle has sought to address since 2011. And I should say it's not just the guiding principles, it's OECD-Watch with the guiding principle, using the guiding principles. But as we've seen, the issue is still as dire as it was 10 years ago. Some progress in some cases, but by and large, no systemic changes. How much headway have we made? What needs to be ensured in order for the CS3D to actually bring us forward and make a real difference? You have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lene. When you say I've been doing this a long time, that's decades, which is far too long, probably. I want to just start with a couple of points, bringing forward some of the excellent work that Lene and his team has done. If you could just turn to the next slide, please. The core issue for me about access to remedy is to have the rights holder at the center. Often that is not where it starts. It starts from the business perspective or the state's perspective, but we move it towards the rights holder at the center. And the working group has worked very closely with Lene's team in looking at the issue of remedy. I've just got 3 quick quotations. The first one is, of course, about the rights holder at the center. And the centrality is not only the rights holder who might be here, but remembering in a way what Anna's saying, the rights holders are often a very long way away from where the business might be headquartered. So remembering that the global south is at the heart of a lot of this. The second point is effectiveness. And the effectiveness is about effectiveness of a remedy to the victims. So that, for example, a fine to a company has no impact on a victim. That goes into the state's coffers, it doesn't go towards the victim. And often it is a long way down the track before that happens. And the third element is accountability. So we're going beyond responsibility to accountability. And the UN Guiding Principles is very clear that they're comfortable with the various forms of responsibility, including accountability, and particularly by states in their regulation. And the evidence shows very clearly that reporting alone does not work. So if you could move to the next slide, please. The next slide sets out, and I'm not going to go through them, you'll be pleased to know, these are just some of the many, many barriers to access to remedy, which I, as a litigation lawyer acting for these a number of these different rights holders, find when trying to even bring a case within the EU. So this idea that there's an abuse of litigation going on, it is so hard to bring a case, I cannot tell you. It is really, really hard. And probably less than 1% of the many cases even get to court. And then it can take 12 years just for the court to decide it has jurisdiction. So being aware that there are so many obstacles and that we need to be aware that these obstacles are there. And so, for example, Anna mentioned the idea of extraterritorial. Actually, it's transnational legislation for transnational companies we're talking about. We accept the transnational nature of a company. We should accept the transnational potential of litigation. And many of these cases, had there been proper access to remedy through an operating grievance mechanism, wouldn't be needing to be at these courts. So there are aspects which companies can do to make sure these barriers don't work, but it's a real need in the CSDDD that there should be removal of many of these barriers. Otherwise, the cases are still going to be blocked up. My final slide, if I could just have it, is you'll be pleased to know a series of the cases, or if you could go back one, please. There we go. I'm not going to go through these cases, you'll be pleased to know. I just wanted to show this is the mood that's happening. There are more and more cases happening across a range of different jurisdictions and on different matters. I haven't got one there, but Gabrielle Holly was talking about Downstream. There's an excellent OECD case against JCB for its sale of products into the occupied Palestinian territories. That's an example where we can see a downstream issue. The other element here in one of these cases, which is the one which is Equitable Cambodia and ANZ, is a financial institution being found to be acting in a way which leads to a human rights abuse. So financial sector has to be included. And I've just done a country visit to Luxembourg. That was probably the greatest refrain I said, financial sector has to be included in these matters. So there's a sense to which these cases show the mood is moving by the courts because they realize that there are real issues here that need to be resolved. But remembering, if you go back one step, these are a tiny percentage of cases. So my last slide is just saying some of the issues which the CSDDD directive can look at these things and can consider ways forward and actually remember that the rights holder at the center. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert, and also thanks for being very much on time. And also thanks for raising the question, the sphere of abusive litigation that we hear repeatedly, that certainly in the European context, it does seem to be one that is vastly overstated when it comes to some of the engagements around the directive. I would now like to pass on to Tia Bonfour, Litigation and Advocacy Officer on Environment in the French legal NGO Sherpa. Sherpa is also a member of the European Coalition for Corporate Justice. So Sherpa has been trying to bring cases against French companies for overseas harms in the supply chain for many years now. So if you can tell us a little bit about the barriers that you have faced to bring in these cases and how the directive could address these. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to participate in these discussions. So I will present two of our ongoing cases that I believe are very good examples of the obstacles that victims and CSOs are still facing in their quest to access justice. And the first case I want to mention is the Perenco case. So it's a case we've been facing major obstacles in that case that was brought by Sherpa together with the French NGO Friend of the Earth. And because this case, first, it relates to allegations of environmental damage resulting from Perenco's oil activities in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We've been facing a real opacity because there's a real opacity in Perenco's corporate structure, because both the French and the Congolese companies are formerly held through shell companies in the Bahamas. So it means that it's really difficult to access information about its operation and organization, and in particular with respect to the links between the French company and the Congolese companies that are operating their activities on the ground. I also want to mention a point that is really important, is that in France, as maybe in many other European countries, you don't have a specific procedure. There's a lack of discovery or disclosure procedure under French law, and therefore there is a real difficulty to access material evidence that are by nature in the possession of a company. So what we did in that case is that we try to use the existing provisions under French law to access the material evidence in possession of the company. So we filed an ex parte request for investigative measures back in 2019 to be enforced by the judicial officer. And this request included the seizure of documents within the company premises in Paris. The request was first granted by the judge, but then the company obstructed the enforcement of the court order, preventing the bailiff to enter its corporate premises. So we had to get back to court and ask a second time to access these documents. And we lost in first instance and then in appeal, and we had to refer the case to the Cour de Cassation in France. So you see, it really was a very long and hard battle in courts, and the debates shifted to legal issues such as the applicable law to prove our legal standing. So I won't get into too many details, but it shows how difficult it is to access information on a corporate structure. And finally, in November 2022, we finally took judicial action against Perenco before the Paris Judicial Court, but without having access in these documents. So the burden of proof still relies on us in this procedure. So you see, it's very difficult. So I just want to emphasize the fact that for the CSDDD, what this illustrates is that there is the need for a right to know procedure, specific right to know or access to information procedure that would compel companies to disclose the information that's on their activities, on their corporate structure that are on their possession. And also, I also join the previous voice here to say there is also the need to reverse the burden of proof. This is really crucial in this aspect, because when it comes to information, we're talking about that are by definition in the possession of the company. It is impossible or to have this burden of proof relying on only on victims and CSOs. So now I want very briefly to present another case that would also illustrate the need for the access to justice. Yeah, very quickly. Just to mention another of our cases, that is the Total case. Maybe you've heard of it. It's the climate case against Total that we've launched, and on the basis of the French law on the duty of vigilance. And it's a case where our objective is to compel the companies to reduce its greenhouse gases emissions in accordance with the objective of the Paris Agreement. And why I'm talking about this case now, but it's because we rely on two legal bases that enable preventive judicial action. It means actually before the damage has actually occurred. And in our case, we rely specifically on the provisions under the duty of vigilance law that enable these provisional measures. And so this case illustrates, especially for environmental and climate damage, the importance of judicial review mechanisms, but also to allow the judge to preventively enjoin the company to comply with its duty of vigilance obligations. So just to sum up my two main points were the reverse of the burden of proof, the need to a specific right to know or information procedure, and also the importance of preventive judicial action that is actually missing in the draft presented by the Commission, where actually at its stakes, the text only provides for civil liability mechanism, but does not allow for this type of preventive judicial measures even before the damage has actually occurred. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and also for these very concrete proposals. Last but not least, we have Anusha Vahidi, who is Head of Unit, Sustainable Transformation of Global Supply Chains at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's really great to have you here on the panel, Anusha. It's very important to have also the perspective of a government who has experience in these matters on the panel. So you have much experience monitoring access to justice measures through global supply chains for the German government. So what, in your view, needs to change in order for the directive to deliver on Pillar 3 of the guiding principles, and deliver on enabling access to effective remedy and actually make a difference for victims? Thank you, Anusha.
Yes, thank you very much, Lena, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much also to Heidi and to Barry for this very important meeting. I was very pleased to be asked to talk in one of these panel sessions, as I think we're in a crucial moment now for the CSDDD. And it's always good to have a great panel with experts. So most of the points that I was actually noting have been already said here or in the previous panels when we were talking about certifications on the one hand and also the value chain. So let me just concentrate on three major aspects from Germany's point of view. As you know, our due diligence and supply chain Act has come into force beginning of this year. So, and we worked very strongly together with the public authority, the BAFA, which will conduct the implementation of our law. And speaking of access to remedy or a better access to justice, I would like to highlight the important work of the EU Agency of Fundamental Rights, the FRA. And within our German presidency in 2020, we included that in the Council's conclusion, and we urged the member states to really look into the work of the FRA. And most of what it's been said has been echoed, and I would like to highlight 2 points in that regard. So it's the first pillar that I would like to say, that I would like to discuss today. It's the strengthening rights holders. Robert, you said putting rights holders at the center, absolutely. And as Anna, and I'm very happy that Anna also echoed that, and also the very important issue of the burden of proof, more equality in burden of proof. As we know, we have a huge language barrier, but also financial barriers for the ones who are affected. So we have to find a mechanism for that. It could be a rebuttable presumption. That's something that's also been discussed in Germany. But also what we have already in Germany is the right to inspect the files of the public authority. So these could be 2 concrete ideas on how to overcome that really barriers that we see, and to take into account that these barriers exist. I think that's the most important issue. And I'm very happy that Sar and Diraj were also here and echoed that, because we need that perspective from the Global South. And very happy that Anna's here today as well. And the second thing that we already included in our German legislation is the representative action. You will also find that in the FRA recommendations. NGOs and trade unions must be allowed to file lawsuits in their names for those affected. And I think that will be a huge, it would make things easier for the ones who are affected. That will be basically the first pillar, strengthening the rights of the right holders when damages already have been done. But the second pillar that I would like to concentrate is the preventive point of view, maybe adds a few aspects, 3 aspects. One of them was very much discussed in the previous panels, is the risk-based approach. This is really crucial. This is what we've done in the German legislation, and this has to be included in the CSDDD. So especially for businesses, they don't need to tackle all the problems and risks within the supply chains. It's really networks, not only chains, but they have to look at the severe risks, and they have to find a mechanism. They have to set up a risk management tool. So this is the heart of the German legislation, and they have to then prioritize their risk. And I think we have to give businesses the space to prioritize, which would be also an important message that I would like to deliver today. And the second and third thing, preventive measures, we're talking about power imbalances. And I think this is something that you cannot stress enough. Power balances between the global north and the global south, and especially between buyers and suppliers, and especially between employers and workers. So how to overcome that? I think responsible purchasing practices is one of the main issues that we included in the German legislation. So what does responsible mean? Responsible means that buyers should give suppliers the opportunity to negotiate on fair prices, on lead times, on fair payment. And the third thing within this pillar is living wages and living income. And I think that the CSDDD needs to reflect the living income as well, because we heard from Diraj, there is a lot of the informal sector, but we also have the huge agricultural sector where we have a lot of informal workers or farmers. So that needs to be included as well. So that will be the second pillar. And the third pillar, from a governmental point of view, is the public authority. As I said, we have the BAFA, the authority for export control, that will be in charge in Germany to monitor what the businesses set out and if the risk management tools and the measures that the businesses outline, if they actually work and improve and bring improvements on the ground, like the colleagues from the Global South actually were highlighting, and also what Anna was highlighting. And we foresee, for instance, an evaluation clause within our German law. By mid of 2026, we will evaluate the measures predominantly from the feedback that we get from the BAFA. On the one hand, the reports that are coming in, but also the BAFA serves as a complaints mechanism. So people can complain at the BAFA, and then we will see if the measures actually had impact on the ground. I think that's the most important issue for us. And I would like to conclude and thank you once again, also ECCJ. And I think we need more conversations like that, which include more and more and put at the center the Global South, because we come up with due diligence legislations because we would like to strengthen and not only the rights of the rights holders, but also acknowledge that there is a power imbalance between the Global North and the Global South. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And you picked up on, and indeed all the panelists picked up on so many important points that I'm very regretful that we are going to have to close. But I think I just want to, Anusha, just call out and really appreciate your emphasis on effective public authorities. I mean, we did together with, so OECD-Watch together with Shift, published a report, I think in 2021. I can't believe how fast time is flying, but on regulatory enforcement. So this panel has focused very much on access to justice through judicial mechanisms and civil liability. But it is just so important to appreciate that the courts can't carry the whole burden of enforcement and oversight of this directive. So really pushing very hard on getting properly resourced, properly mandated regulatory enforcement bodies that can work across the 27 member states also in a coordinated manner if this directive is going to be effective, enforced in a way that is coherent across the EU. So thanks very much for pointing that out. So I think I'm looking at the organizers. I think we are at time. We are just about 10 minutes over time. So thank you so much. Thanks to ECCJ, thanks to the excellent panelists, and please join in giving them a hand. And thanks to all of you for being here.